cam I dug out that I had bought a few years back. That's a lot better. So higher quality. So I've got that like rigged up on an old music stand between me and the computer. So I can see you, but like through this web of other.
Well, I can see the Cavern Cave poster.
Yeah, that's the important part.
Real clean.
It's real clear today.
That's the focal point of any time we gather.
The Cavern Club.
So we're live. We're live on Facebook.
Yeah, we are.
Joining us there. Thank you.
Letting people filter in and
live on Zoom. Going. Folk are coming in. Hello, everybody.
You know what the Cavern Club is now, right? Like I explained that to you.
Yeah, where the Beatles performed.
Yeah, it was like the correct? Beatles' early venue. Yeah.
Nice.
And it's still there. So, I mean, this poster actually is, when I ordered it, I'm like, oh, I kind of thought it would be like an old photo that they had colorized. But if you look at the deets on this one, it's got actually like the dates and stuff on it are current dates.
Wow.
Yeah. So this is a like modern photo of a modern of the building as it looks today. But I know you can go there and like tour it, and they still have music and stuff.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah. In fact, I think you're not into the Beatles like I am, but the guy that does the carpool karaoke.
Oh, golly,
yeah, the late night guy. I know. I feel like
Corden.
Yeah, James Corden.
James Corden.
He did one with McCartney, and they went around Liverpool, and it was fantastic. I believe they went to the Cavern Club in that one.
Nice.
So now I'm gonna have to go back and look at it and see.
If you found yourself in the back seat with Mr. Corden and Paul McCartney, would you be hopping on those tunes as well?
No. No, my singing, that was, I played in a lot of bands throughout the years. In fact, it's only been the last decade that I haven't. Once the kids were born, I kind of, edged out of that. But the one thing that held true through all of that is that I was not the singer. I can carry a tune when I'm by myself in the car. If I'm with anyone else, and I'm kidding. I don't even carry a tune when I'm by myself. I just can imagine that I do.
You can just stay behind the drum kit, though it is quite the spectacle whenever you see the drummer hopping on the vocals simultaneously.
It is. And the thing is like I'm capable of doing it. I can sing along, but my singing is just not very good. The early band that I was in, the very first one, those guys were excellent singers. I mean, they went on to actually get the group that I was in high school, believe it or not. That group of guys, minus me, because I was 3 years younger than all of them, they went on to form a band or become part of a band and got nominated for a Grammy and toured all over. I mean, they were fantastic. They one time we were working on this vocal thing, and they really wanted one more part. And they were so desperate, they looked at me and they're like, "You can sing this, right?" And I'm like, "Yeah, no problem." And so they hooked me up with a mic. They got all set up, and they're like, "All right, here's your part." And I'm playing along, and I came in, and they just looked at each other like, "Whoa, no, stop!" Like,
we'll find someone else.
Yeah, like we'll just do without that vocal part. Like that's really not as essential as we thought it was.
Well, let's stick with what you are fantastic at, Chuck, and that is advocating for strong towns. Top of the hour. Thank you for joining us live, everyone, for another round of our new weekly webinar series, Ask Me Anything. This is a weekly series where we answer your most pressing questions about your place and the steps you can take to make it a stronger, more resilient place. I have Chuck joining me today to answer some questions in response to a presentation he shared this past Tuesday about making strong neighborhood investments. A classic Strong Towns presentation. Chuck, how long have you been presenting that Neighborhoods First presentation?
Oh, that was the second one after the curbside chat. So I would say like 4 or 5 years.
Okay.
And it's changed and evolved over time, but the essence of it really gets to that, what is the barbell strategy and the idea of, what makes a good banker investment, what makes a good, what makes a good venture capital investment. So yeah, that one, and that as actually, is it chapter 8 or 9 of the book? Chapter 8 of the book
Yeah, with Michael
begins
Iden
with,
and the folk.
yep,
Mhm.
exactly. Chapter 8 of the book is basically like the neighborhood's first concept and the neighborhood's
Yeah.
first idea expanded upon.
Yeah, well, and more timely than ever, and a particularly actionable message as well. And I think after we look at the presentation, knock out these questions, as folk begin to walk around their neighborhoods, they'll see several examples of where the message that you've shared is applicable for their own place. So
Right.
really excited to dig into these questions and hopefully provide some helpful insights for folk.
Do you, can I give you a tiny update?
Sure.
Um, So one of the hard things about that presentation and about like this, I love talking about the topic in general because I think it's one that applies in so many places, and showing it to other people really gets people stimulated. But when I come back to my city, it's a very like deep frustration that I have. And it's hard not to express it in anger with the airport because we literally squandered $13.5 million on a project that I think is just it's a terrible project. And you know, most of that is debt now, debt that I will have to repay over decades. My neighbors will have to repay. It's essentially like our optionality on the future is gone. Last week it was announced, and I've been wanting to write about this, but I haven't found a good way to do it without just sounding like sour grapes. Last week it was announced that the airport, as part of the, I don't even know what bill it was, but one of these federal like legislations involving the COVID relief, you know, whatever. The local airport here got $18.5 million of money just given to them. And, you know, they were quoting the paper saying, you know, wow, this is great. We're going to do some economic development stuff and what have you. Just so we don't lose track of numbers, $18 million is 3 times the city's total levy in a year. The airport, it was reported in the same article, they're still running their 2 flights a day. They're 95% empty. So they're at 5% capacity, spending three years of the city's levy in just like, here's money to run.
Wow.
And it's one of these things where it's like, at some point, these most fragile parts of our system are going to go away. And, you know, the nonsense of these types of investments will be revealed for that, like the high risk, high gamble, like bad bet that it was. And we're going to need people who can pick up the pieces and do some of the stuff like I presented the other day, like, you know, those kinds of projects. So it's another one of these like astounding things where you're like, if this area, if this region were given $18.5 million and said, do good with this, the very last thing on that list of doing good would be running 5% full flights twice a day down to Minneapolis, St. Paul Airport and back. I mean, especially since there's like a bus shuttle that goes back and forth like 12 times a day. You know, like why would we do this? But yet this is what our system is set up to do, and it will continue to do it until it either breaks and goes away or we demand that it stop.
Absolutely. And the contrast we'd see as you present the latter part of the presentations, a lot of those small bets more so than trying to have prime rib in between one of 2 flights coming out of the airport. Let's get started.
Yeah, let's do it.
Folk joining us live, thank you. We want to ask or answer your questions throughout this presentation. If you hover over your Zoom window, you'll see a Q&A button. Click that bad boy, ask your question, and we will get it answered. Chuck, first question, I'm going to start with a pre-submitted one from our friend Gail in the Strong Towns community site.
Yeah.
Gail asks, is there a risk of incremental projects being used by city staffers and politicians as a distraction from larger city issues? And then Gail goes on to give the example of, you know, perhaps the city officials are celebrating the street trees that some caring citizens planted while simultaneously they're building yet another unnecessary road on the other side of town. From your work, have you seen examples of that where you know, maybe we see the small bets as more so just like fluff, something to put on the front page of a paper or the sub or the Chamber of Commerce instead of understanding this is actually a really productive investment for us.
Right. No, that in fact, I think that is probably the default up to this point has been, boy, isn't this cute? And I'm going to get behind this because planting trees feels nice. And, bike lanes, we got some people who are happy about this. And cities have tended to treat this as like the extra thing, as the fluff. And I think the way you'll know that your community is doing it right, and this gets into chapter 9 of my book, goes into depth about how to reorganize your government and how your government should be thinking about this. Right now, our local governments tend to orient towards what they see as the capital in their, that they have to deal with. So they tend to orient themselves at the bottom of a food chain of money, and they try to position themselves to get the most of that cash flow. So how much money is coming from the state government? How much money is coming from the federal government? How much can we get from Wall Street and from the investment community to channel in and to funnel into our community? Mm-hmm. Really successful cities, and cities that I think that are going to make this transition the best, are going to be ones that position themselves and orient themselves in a totally different direction. What's going on in our neighborhoods? What's going on with our people? How do we best serve their urgent needs? And then kind of turning around and saying, all right, are there capital flows that can assist us in that? But I'm not going to just like chase capital flows. Mm-hmm. For example, right now in my community, we are in the advanced stages of planning for a children's museum. Yep. If you said a children's museum would be a good thing or a bad thing, almost everybody in the city would say, sure, children's museum would be a good thing. If you went out and asked people, name the top 20 things that the city should be doing today, children's museum would not make the list for anybody. Mm-hmm. And if you went out and like walked around with people and observed how people struggle in the community, children's museum would never show up. I mean, that's not like the urgent need. Why are we focused on a children's museum? Why is that like one of the top priorities of the community? It's clear because there's a program at the state level that funds children's museums. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so all of a sudden now children's museums are like the thing we need to do. And we have our government and all the players within it trying to sell us on the idea of a children's museum. I do think that in normal times, we can tend to treat this stuff as like frivolous. You'll know that your government is starting to get it. And you know that they're figuring it out and they're doing the right thing. If they don't, if they make it the core growth strategy for the community, balanced with a strong dedication to maintenance and essentially taking care of the things you already have, starting with the high productivity neighborhoods and working back from there. So yeah, it's a valid question. And I think you'll know they're serious when they make that change.
Yeah. And you raise a great point about, comparing the two different approaches to development. The one you share with the neighborhoods first approach, where we're humbly observing where people struggle, doing the next small thing to address that struggle, compared to if we're positioning ourselves up on this financial food chain. Our priorities are dictated by whatever program is happening there.
Right.
As you said before, Children's Museum is fantastic. Do we need one right now? Not so much, but if we can get some money for it, that's where we're going to be shifting our priorities.
Right. And what you see, it really is pernicious because it's hard to be against a children's museum, right? Mm-hmm. And it's hard to say like, this is not a good thing. But yet when you look at City Hall, how much of the city administrator's time, how much of the city engineer's time, how much of the city's planner's time, how much of the city council meeting, how much of their energy, how much of like the regional conversation is all now focused on what is really an ancillary non-urgent need. Mm-hmm. Even before coronavirus hit, this community had tons of urgent needs. Our focus should be on those. And if our focus is on those, like I demonstrated in the presentation, there's a lot of investments that we can make that are within our budget today and are within our capacity. And the thing is, you get momentum going there. Your neighborhoods start to improve. They start to actually build wealth. People there become part of the solution. And then, yes, there's an opportunity to look at capital streams and say, mm-hmm. all right, here's the urgent need. Is there some way that, the federal government is seeking to fund that, or the state is seeking to fund that? But that is basing your cues off of, the needs of your community, not what you can essentially get paid to do.
Let's take a live question. Got one from Jacob. Jacob says, so it sounds like this is a disconnect between government and neighborhood issues. Is this a question of power? What sort of coalitions tend to build the most power? So I suppose he's saying, maybe in our community, we've recognized that the way we've currently been doing public investment isn't working. We're not getting a return on it. It's not making people's lives better. What sorts of coalitions do we need to have on the ground to be able to have more of that co-creation that you talked about throughout your presentation?
Right. I think that's a legitimate question in the context of where we're at today. I look down at like Minneapolis, 2 hours south of me here, and the Minneapolis Bike Coalition has been one of the most effective advocacy organizations that I've ever run across.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of people who cheer for the Minneapolis Bike Coalition and say, yes, like we need more of that. That's bottom up. And I appreciate what they've done, and I've felt like a kinship with them in terms of what they're trying to do. But I just kind of have rejected the whole idea that this is like a good way to do governance. Essentially, what you have is a big kind of out of touch, long feedback loop kind of system of governance. And in order to be heard by that, you have a whole bunch of people getting together and having, a bigger hammer to kind of bash them over the head with.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like the reaction is, how do we create our own, Leviathan to fight against, the Leviathan that is ignoring us?
Mm-hmm.
I think we already have that. We have that is to me what local government and I think this kind of complex web of civic institutions, of which a neighborhood coalition, a bike coalition, different groups of people coming together is all part of.
Mm-hmm.
But at the end of the day, the Leviathan that can go against federal government and the state government in advocating for what we want to see is actually the local government.
Mm-hmm.
If I call up my governor today, he's not going to pick up the phone. If the mayor of Brainerd calls the governor today, they will actually pick up the phone.
Mm-hmm.
And so, to me, what I would like to see us evolve to is a form of local government that is not the implementation arm of state and federal policy, where how do we create a local government to implement state and federal policy and then sell that to people? And we have these really long feedback loops where in the Minneapolis Bike Coalition, thing, we're funding all kinds of stroads from the state capitol. We're funding all kinds of highways through the neighborhood. We can't get a bike lane. We can't get a good sidewalk.
Mm-hmm.
We've got too wide lanes, too fast traffic. And so we have to have this big neighborhood coalition rise up to be able to go to the legislature and advocate on our behalf, and go to the city hall and advocate on our behalf. No, what we should have is cities that orient towards the urgent needs of people.
Mm-hmm.
So that the feedback loop between the problem and the people dealing with the problem is a lot shorter. Right now, and I can't remember where I last used this example, but maybe it was on one of these web broadcasts. If you imagine having a shower, and when you're in the shower and you turn the handle hot to cold, you get kind of immediate feedback. But imagine if you turn the handle and instead of the valve being there, the valve was like in the basement of your house or 4 rooms over. What would happen is you would turn the valve and then there would be no change in the water at all till it worked all its way through that pipe. And then you would get, the change. And you was like, oh, it's too cold. And you turned it hot. And then it would be scalding. And then it would be too hot. And you would turn it cold and it would stay hot, stay hot, stay hot, stay hot. And then all of a sudden it would be freezing. That's what long feedback loops do. And that's what we see with these, coalitions are rising up basically to say, like, look, this isn't working.
Mm-hmm.
But the reason it's not working is not because the state has the wrong priorities and they're bad people, or the federal government's run by idiots, or, it's that the feedback loop is too far.
Mm-hmm.
The pain being experienced is not having any type of response mechanism
Mm-hmm.
at the local government level where it should. And if we fix that feedback loop, what happens is we get better governance.
And it sounds like this is a feedback loop of items that we're measuring that actually contribute to the prosperity of our place, whether it's looking at the bottom line of a particular intervention, are we getting a return on the investment that we've made, or just from simple observation anecdotes, is this making people's lives easier compared to maybe, you gave the example of the Children's Museum. Have you noticed that instead it's not so much feedback of it's just making people's lives better, but more so like, are we meeting like the niche criterion to actually get
right.
this funding? Is that like
that's exactly what happens?
We're looking for?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And the thing is, because humans are good and because we actually want to do good, what happens then is this really perverse thing where we take and we overlay a narrative of need onto something like the Children's Museum. So we'll say, well, the school district tells us we have all these needy parents, and these people over here tell us that, and so we start to identify the convenient kind of urgent needs that
Mm-hmm.
meet our policy priority. That's the thing we want to do. And what I'm suggesting is something deeper and almost more painful, but more also satisfying, which is we have to expose ourselves to the urgent needs of people in our communities.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the worst government that I've seen is government that tries to distance itself from painful feedback. So in my days working as a planner and engineer, there was a sense that you never wanted to say anything negative about what was happening. You always had to be positive. And even when something was going bad, you had to present a positive face to the public, because we've got to look like we're competent and look like we know what we're doing. And we have to, in almost a propaganda sense, speak, right about it, because we were trying to sell them something. The reality is the best local governments I've experienced are the ones that say, look, we're here working with you. We know things aren't perfect. They're never going to be solved. But how do we identify like what the thing is and then make it a little bit better, and then a little bit better, and then a little bit better? And how do we start working on that? And they open themselves up to the notion that not only are we not perfect, but this is like a work in progress, and we have to do this together. Those are the places that I've seen, and those are the leaders that I've seen be the most effective and get the most done. And people respond to that. I mean, that they don't like to be sold, a lie. They'd rather be dealt with honestly where they are.
Totally.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chuck. Let's take another live question. Got one from our friend Don. Don asks, what is the best way for a member of a municipal plan commission, he's a volunteer resident, to begin to incorporate the Strong Towns principles? I think for this example, we'll focus on, these low cost, low interventions into the minds of the city. So say I'm on this commission, they're talking different public investments, and I'm noticing that all my peers are, kind of going towards more of that orderly but as opposed to chaotic but smart approach. What's some ways that I can try to advocate for the latter?
So I feel like I'm not the best spokesman for this. I feel like John Reuter, one of our board members, has actually done the best work on this and is actually better at this than I am. I'm going to try to quote him a little bit and tell you what he would say, because I was on a plan commission for 3 years here in Brainerd. I got off the commission at the end of last year and was asked to rejoin, and I have not. It was not very fulfilling to me. If I look back, I would say I made progress, but the places I made progress was because I was following John's advice. John's advice is very, what I would just say, pragmatic in terms of how to advance change. What John advised me to do is look for opportunities. So don't go in with your agenda. Don't go in with like, here's the 10 things that need to change. You have to build relationships with people. You have to build trust with people. You have to compromise and work with people so they will work with you. Losing 6-1 votes on principle does you no good when you're actually trying to get something done. But then look for opportunities to advance ideas and notions, because what you will find on a planning commission is that repeatedly ridiculous things will come at you. Repeatedly things will come in front of you that you're like, this is either a ridiculous application. Why are we here? Why are we doing this? Why is this a thing? Or why am I being asked to approve something that's so clearly backward and wrong? Those are opportunities not to be like the burr in a sandal in a negative way, but those are opportunities to present an alternate vision. Okay, so like for me, we had a drugstore that came in, one of the mini big box ones. It wasn't Walgreens or CVS, but it was a local version of that. So like a Midwestern version called Thrifty Drug. Thrifty Drug came in and they wanted to build the typical like big box store. They were going to tear down 5 buildings. And in fact, they did tear down 5 buildings, put a big parking lot right next to the neighborhood, orient the building in a bad way. They were going to do damage to the community. And in fact, they got approval to do this damage. It was met our code and everybody supported it. But as part of that process, we were able to kind of educate people, pulled some numbers on, okay, look at this block. Let's go look at the Walgreens up the street and look at the value per acre of that. Let's look at the value per acre here. Let's look at the value per acre on this very poor, rundown, blighted property over here. And look, the rundown, blighted property one is actually better. The Walgreens is actually the lowest. Look, so we use this as an opportunity to explain why going down this path over and over wasn't the best approach. And as part of that, we were then able to say, okay, for me, I'm going to lose this one on Thrifty. Like Thrifty is going to be approved. Everybody's on board. But what I'm going to do is get the ordinance changed, get the parking lot requirements changed, the lighting changed, the neighborhood interface changed, so that this kind of thing can't happen again. And guess what? We got all that done. So there is a certain, I think, pragmatism to being part of a structure like this, where you can't just go in guns a-blazing and change everything overnight. If you could, it would be done. I mean, there's a lot of people who would like to see that done. But you have to go in and be humble, build coalitions, and wait for your opportunity to make the case for what you want to do.
Let's ask or knock out another pre-submitted question. Got one from our friend Gordon. Gordon says, the presentation was great. I now have a much better understanding of incremental projects. Do you have more examples of these types of projects? So I know in the latter part of your presentation, Chuck, you give examples of some of those small bets you made in Brainerd,
right.
DIY bike lane, trimming up some trees to make sure the park was visible. Some of just these low cost, low lift interventions to try to make places more productive. From your work, I know we talked a little bit about Mempix. Any other examples come to mind of these types of small bets that you've seen?
There's a bunch of them, very formal and informal. I mean, you see places like Los Angeles and Seattle setting up like pop-up if you want to put street seating in, they've made it so you can just walk into City Hall very quickly, like show them what you want to do and then go out and do it. They've actually like pre-approved the specs for doing it in a sense so that they can get more of this in places. I think the best like repository of examples is the Tactical Urbanism book.
Yeah.
And I mean, I would highly recommend getting that book and then going out, reading that book and then going out and spending time in your community with, if it's not you who has this mindset, there are other people who do, and you'll find them like they're the hacker kind of mindset. There's always, I mean, I've got uncles like this, and my grandfather was a little bit like this, and my dad to a degree. But it was like, these guys grew up on a farm, and like, if the tractor didn't work, you could take baling twine and duct tape and,
I'm sure,
make the thing. Yeah. You bootstrapped it together. You like made it work. And I think there's a certain, every community has those kind of people. If you say, here's the problem, here's like the MacGyver toolkit you got, like, how would you do this? The great thing about these interventions is that we can try them very small, and like iterate, see what works. We can take it down the next day if it doesn't. The other repository of this stuff that is just fantastic is the Better Block.
Yeah.
And if you do a Google search for Better Block Foundation, you're going to get Jason Roberts and the group out of Dallas, Texas there. And they have put on their website an entire like do-it-yourself toolkit to download. What problem do you have? Here's like 5 solutions that have been tried and tested. And here's templates for carving out different benches out of different materials. And I mean, the stuff that they've created is astounding. I would go there and just, plug into that repository and start there with your ideas.
Yeah, there's a lot of fantastic stuff there. I'm just about 30 minutes from Oak Cliff, where Jason Roberts and the Better Block crew are at.
Right.
They're doing some really exciting stuff.
Oh, well, and the amazing thing about it is Jason Roberts is astounding. I personally love him. Like, I love him. Like, I have deep affection for this guy. He is kind and generous, and he is just like a wonderful human being. But I'm going to say something now, and I think he would agree with me. I'm going to say it like this. There's nothing really special about Jason Roberts, in the sense that there's a Jason Roberts in your community too. I mean, he is an extraordinary person, and he is very special, and he's incredibly dynamic. And the fact that he has created what he's created is astounding. And I think we should all, just admire him as deeply as I do, because he is worthy of deep admiration. But the thing is, if you meet Jason Roberts and you get to know him, you'll recognize him because you recognize those people around you. Every community has a lot of these creative, innovative, kind of do it yourself, make things happen kind of people. And I think the thing that is extraordinary about Jason is he's not allowed himself to be sidelined, and he's found himself in like a fertile environment in Oak Cliff, where there's a lot of other like artistic people and people who are willing to step up, and he's surrounded himself with like creative people. But I can go to any poor, downtrodden neighborhood in this country, and all you got to do is like scratch the surface, and you're going to find incredibly creative people who are out there hacking their way through life every day, who have been sidelined by our current system, who, if they were brought into the conversation, would produce amazing things.
Well, Chuck, I have another great question that ties well into that. This person asks, is there any money available for these small incremental changes? So when we talk about, we know that there's creative people like this in our neighborhoods. They're trusting their observations. They're considering those next small interventions to address those struggles. But oftentimes when they look to the city, there may not be funding available for that. Plenty for big interventions, large projects, but not so much for those local creatives that want to do something fun. Have you seen examples of cities who have kind of repositioned themselves to make sure that there are funding streams for these small bets, either by private citizens or the government itself?
I'm going to answer that in 3 ways. The first one is to reject the question. And I'm going to reject it in the sense that, like, every place where I've seen this become a thing that has worked, it started with people with no money doing things with no money or very little money. And so I think when one of the first, and I'm not suggesting this person is doing this, but I see this a lot. It's like, oh, Chuck, this is great. How do we get funding for it? When that's the first thought out of your brain, you're thinking of this wrong. You're starting in the wrong place. And I would say you're too comfortable. You're too comfortable. So let's answer it then in a couple other ways. I do see philanthropic communities as being good catalysts for getting some of this going. We can go to Memphis. And in the very early days of some of the innovation in Memphis, it was not driven by the local government. The local government, in fact, years ago was kind of resistant to this stuff. It was philanthropy. It was, people who wanted to see change, who seeded some of this stuff in very tactical, strategic kind of ways.
Mhm.
Let's get this going. So I think if you're frustrated with local government not doing this, you should be looking to philanthropic organizations and others. But I would not go to them with an application request. I would go to them with a series of small things that I've done on a hacker's budget with a
Mhm.
hacker's mindset, saying like, this is what we did with $50. Could you give us 500 or could you give us 5,000? Here's what we would do. Now you're actually making the case through your actions. I think the third thing though, that is the most important one is that the money is there.
Mhm.
Every city in North America has the budget to do what I outlined the other day in the Neighborhoods First presentation. There is no community that lacks the resources or the means to invest incrementally in their own neighborhoods and improve the quality of life for people and make their neighborhoods wealthier, stronger, and more prosperous. There's no city that lacks the capacity to do it. And so money for getting started is not the object,
Mhm.
the barrier here. It's focus, it's attention, and it's how we're spending our resources.
Yeah. I want to take a moment to talk about Allendale. Whenever you showed the map, I think it was of Lafayette in your presentation,
Yeah.
and we identified the neighborhoods that weren't generating enough revenue to cover their liabilities, and then the
Right.
highly productive neighborhoods where revenue exceeded its expenses. We see a great example of the latter in a neighborhood in
Shreveport. Yeah, you
Shreveport.
were there with me, weren't you?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
was. Called Allendale. I think this is a
Yep.
great example of a neighborhood where, of course, we've identified that's highly productive. It has that traditional development pattern, but we've seen some great private citizens embrace that incrementalism, show a lot of love to their place, and we've seen some fantastic transformation that was citizen-led. Can you speak a little bit about that neighborhood and maybe give an example of, the kinds of transformation that you've seen whenever we allow neighborhoods to have a little bit of chaos, whether that's allowing community gardens,
Right.
other
Right.
examples like that?
I don't talk about Allendale enough, and a little bit of it is I feel so overwhelmed and humbled by them and by what they've done and what they continue to do. Um, and I should talk about them more because it's here's a place that in a very poor city, Shreveport, that would have to be called like one of the poorest neighborhoods of Shreveport. So you have a very poor state, Louisiana, you have a poor city within that state, and then you have a very poor subset neighborhood of that. I mean, you're talking about people who, if we just look from like a US Census standpoint, would tick every box of, on the poverty end of the spectrum. Yet if you go there and you meet them and you talk to them and you see what they've done and you see what they do, you see them out, planting flowers in the boulevard. You see them putting up gardens. You see them creating a friendship house and meeting together as a neighborhood to talk about how they can make the neighborhood better, to help other people, getting little neighborhood shops started so that people in the neighborhood who can't drive can still get milk and still get bread and still get essentials. You watch a neighborhood of people who, by all accounts of the way things should be in this country, if you listen to the smart people, as I like to call them, but the people who put programs and things in place, and here's how we solve poverty, and here's how we do that nothing going on in Allendale fits their model. Yet what's going on in Allendale is real. It's making a difference. It's actually improving people's lives, and it's being done despite abject neglect by the city government, despite the fact that the city government is actually trying to run a highway through the middle of their neighborhood. These people are building community, building wealth, making their place more prosperous. If you doubt that this can be done and make a difference, you should go to Allendale and humble yourself to experience it with the people in that community, because they're heroes to me, really. I mean, what they've done is heroic.
Let's take another live question. Got one from our friend Raleigh. Raleigh asks, it strikes me that the value of size, he says, big projects for professionals is common across energy, water, and many other things. Mm-hmm. What suggestions do you have for building countervailing, that's a new term for me, professional rewards for these almost always smaller projects?
Yeah, this is a real hard question. This is a real hard question. And let me say it in a different non-technical way. When I was an engineer, if I were to work on $1 million project, and my fees as an engineer, or the company that I work for, our fees were 10% of that project, that was $100,000 of fees. If I were to go work on a $10,000 project, I couldn't even show up and do 2 meetings for $1,000, for 10% of the fees. My fees to make that happen would have to be 50% or 70% or maybe even 100%. So you'd have a $10,000 project with $10,000 in fees. That's not a viable project from an engineering standpoint. That's not a project that gets approved by city budgets. Those are just not viable projects. And so the problem we have, and this is deep and pernicious within the professions that build cities, is that we're set up to do ever bigger, ever expanding, ever more of these large projects, because that's how the entire pipeline of professionals gets compensated. What I'm talking about, and I think the people who are most threatened by the neighborhood's first approach are the engineering firms, the professionals, the big contractors, everybody who's in line for this, doing the big thing over and over and over. Mm-hmm. And I have struggled, because I realize that this is a resistance. I have struggled to figure out a business model that threatens them less. I have been encouraging and supporting groups like Verdunity out of Dallas, a local, small but growing engineering firm who has been trying to figure out this business model. I mean, I've been meeting with them for a decade. And I remember the early years when they were out, doing Strode work and other work because they had to pay the bills, because they couldn't figure out how to make the rest of it cash flow. They've been able to, over the decade now, transition to an approach that is really centered on this kind of thing, on doing strong towns type of work. And the way they are, I think, positioning themselves to make a living and be compensated is by creating more value for the community. Mm-hmm. So if I'm an engineering firm, or I'm, part of this food chain, I can continue to exist on this quantity kind of approach, or I can start to adapt to a more quality approach. How does spending $1 with me as an engineer save you or get you $5, $10, $20 of return? Mm-hmm. That is a different business model. That is a very different business model. And I think in that business model, a lot of the biggest firms, I think the biggest firms will still be around, because we will still do occasionally large airport projects and huge dams or whatever, but they will be much rarer and very, far less frequent. Mm-hmm. I think what will happen is that a lot of the mid-sized firms are going to go away, because their business model resides in that zone where it's not value adding enough to actually do the smaller, more adaptable, more maintenance focused types of engineering projects we need. But it's also not large enough to be one of the survivors in the, few remaining like large mega projects that are left.
Yeah. And it's not a new model. I mean, I think about healthcare. We're seeing a big trend towards value-based healthcare, where, we're not getting reimbursements based on how many patients we see, but the outcomes that they have.
It's a very good, There's a book called The End of Big by Nico Mele. It was written like a decade ago. I mean, it's getting to be an old book now. And it's interesting because a lot of the findings in there to me were like self-evident.
Mm.
Especially, I think I read it in like 2008 or 9 as we were going through what I thought was like the big crash. Like this was going to be the crash that would reset the economy. Now that we're actually at the crash that seems like it will reset the economy, I went back and started looking at Nico Meli's book again, and it's prophetic.
Mm.
Um, that it is the end of big. It's these small, and what you're really talking about when you're talking about small is adaptable.
Yep.
It's the adaptable structures that I think are going to be the ones that that figure this out.
Yeah. Thank you, Chuck. Folk joining us live, we have about 15 minutes left. If you're sitting on a question, please feel free and go ahead and share it with us. We got a few here in the queue, a few pre-submitted ones, but if you're sitting on one, go ahead and share it now and we'll make sure to knock it out. Let's take another live question. Got one here from our friend Steven in Atlanta. Hey, Steven. Steven asks, Strong Towns advocates for a process of bottom-up feedback and known ways to build productive places. What is a leader to do if residents want the wrong thing, like wider roads, exclusionary zoning, and more free parking? Should leaders override citizen input or stick with the dangerous and bankrupt status quo?
It's a really good question. I think that the tactic to use is to create as much feedback loop as possible.
Mm-hmm.
So I look at like the big dead end cul-de-sac road on the far outskirts of town, and I look at that and I'm like, I'm subsidizing that from here in my core neighborhood. What I would like to see is those areas get some type of like a street. This is something we allowed here to do in Minnesota, like a street improvement district, so that their own money that goes to, street maintenance goes into that budget and is used for their own street. I would do that with their pipes and their utilities and the whole thing, so that they get like the direct feedback of that cost.
Mm-hmm.
That cost isn't put into some big fund, and then whoever can show up with the most political influence gets what they want. I would want, the feedback loop to be there. I also just think that cities can do a lot better job communicating the finances and the math. I mean, this is what we saw from Joe Minicozy over the last couple of weeks. If we do a lot better job communicating the underlying math, yes, there's going to be people who show up and demand, build me a wide road out here in the middle of nowhere. But if we say, well, we don't like wide roads and climate change, and boy, we're trying to do nice bike lanes, and it's going to come across as fluff. But if we go in and say, here's the math, we have 10 cents or 20 cents on the dollar of revenue coming in from our tax base of what we need to maintain this stuff. And so we can't do it. Like, we don't have the money. Mm-hmm. And if you want to fix your road, we'll take the money that you're paying and put it in a fund and allow you to do that. But understand that you're going to have like 5 cents then of what you need to do it. I think we have to have those conversations in a macro sense. Mm-hmm. And not be afraid to say no, but say no based on the math. We're so used to corporations explaining to us why they do things because of their bottom line.
Sure.
And then we look at cities, and cities do really destructive things to their bottom line. And they explain those to us based on, well, this is what you say you want. And I think we have to do the opposite. I think our municipal corporations have to be able to say to the shareholders of that corporation, the people living within the community, hey, this is a bad financial decision for us, and we cannot do it because of our responsibility to our shareholders.
And coming from a place of empathy as well, understanding that we've had a system for the past several decades that put many of us in this position, not so much like per preference. I know subsidies can lead to preference, but this is something that, we didn't necessarily, it wasn't our fault that we found ourselves in this position. Maybe find some common ground from there.
I think the hard thing right now, the hardest thing that we're going to have to deal with right now as our cities go broke is the problem that we can all see Detroit has struggled to deal with, which is what do you do with neighborhoods you can't take care of? What do you do with places that are stuck in decline? And I don't have an answer for that. I mean, there is no, I think, people want an answer that is, here's the solution, like, here's how you fix this. And it's a little bit like, now that you've caught this disease, or now that you've, uh, done this thing, crashed your car or whatever, how do you undo that? You don't do that. You deal with the consequences of it. And I think the difficult transition we have to make is one from, if we could just grow fast enough, we can pretend these are problems with solutions, to, okay, that didn't work. Now we have consequences. Now, how do we, and I'm going to use your word, with as much empathy and understanding as possible, recognize that we've got to make the best out of the situation we can. And I think intellectually, that's a hard shift. That's a really hard shift. And I think it naturally comes with the desire to blame. But I think I would lean in and repeat exactly what you said. There really isn't any, if there's blame to go around, it's blame for us as like a society and a culture. And that's really not helpful. I think that there's a lot of great things about Americanism and American culture and American spirit of, ingenuity and independence, and let's, get it done. We just need to direct that into things that are going to be positive for us now.
Mm-hmm. Let's knock out another live question. Got one from Susan. Chuck, earlier in this presentation, we talked about the map you showed of Lafayette, where we identified the neighborhoods that were highly productive and the ones that were not generating enough revenue to cover expenses. Susan has a question about that phrase. In the statement made, and then in quotes, does revenue exceed its expenses? What are the expenses that are being included? And I think this is a great question, because whenever we talk about the small bets that we need to make, it starts with doing the math and identifying our most productive neighborhoods and showing love to those neighborhoods. Could you give just a brief overview of what actual expenses are included whenever you've done the math on these places?
Yeah. Well, when we look at the Lafayette map in specific, we actually looked at the city's balance sheet and the city's cash flow. So anything that would be an ongoing expense to the city was included in that. So maintaining the streets and the sidewalks and the curb, the drainage systems, the pipes, all that, maintaining their share of the public buildings and the parks, the budget for the police department and the fire department, the transit system, go through the entire city budget. And we allocated those costs to every neighborhood and said, here's their share of these costs. And so what you're looking at there is basically like the cost to run a city. We wouldn't include like one-time things like, I don't know, a financing cost, or if I'm trying to think of like what a one-time expenditure would be, because essentially most of the things that cities do have an ongoing revenue cost to them. But like we even took like the overhead of running elections and doing that and said, what's your share of that across all these different places? The Lafayette map is a map of what it costs to run a government indefinitely. So I think this is maybe the thing that has some nuance, because we didn't look at a snapshot of 1 year where it's like, okay, well, 1 year we didn't spend any money on your road, but we spent money on the road over here. So all of a sudden we have this imbalance. We looked and said, okay, we have a road here. The road is this wide and has, sidewalks or no, or pipe or no, or drainage or no, whatever it is. And based on the components of this road, here is the kind of ongoing expense of that annualized. So if the road would have this expense every 30 years, you can actually take and say that is equivalent to this much expense every year. And so, it wasn't a cash flow map. It was literally like, here is a profit and loss map. On an annualized basis, we should expect to see this type of outflow in this neighborhood and this property and this type of revenue coming in. It's the most thorough analysis of a city budget that I've ever seen. that I've
Yeah.
ever been part of.
Yeah. And I know you guys got all the players involved too, invited everyone from Lafayette city staff to come share their perspectives as well. I know it's quite thorough.
The amount of effort that went into that was astounding.
Yeah.
And I'll say this, it's very interesting because in the early days of Joe's work, Joe was doing these value per acre maps. And, I'm the engineer, he's the revenue guy, and I was the expense guy. And my gut reaction to his stuff was like, this is incredible. But I think people are going to have a lot of questions on the expenses. And I could look at it and I could see, and I had done my own math in a small sense. I mean, I'd done these like neighborhood level analyses and single development level analyses. I'd never done a whole community because the effort was just astounding, even for a small place.
Mm-hmm.
But Joe's work gave like a shortcut to looking at the revenue. And one of the theories that I had was that if we take his revenue maps, his basically financial productivity maps, how would that line up with a full in-depth profit and loss map for a community? So in other words, if you're going to spend 10% of the effort, how does that correlate with one where you'd spend 100% of the effort? So 10 times the effort to get like, what's the result? And the reality is if you line up the productivity map for Lafayette with the profit and loss map for Lafayette, they're almost the same map.
Wow.
I mean, in terms of like general trends, they're the exact same.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Chuck, we have about 5 minutes left. I would love to take this time to talk about the barbell strategy that you discussed in your presentation. Throughout the presentation, you do a great job of encouraging people to identify their most productive neighborhoods. And then we talk about the barbell strategy. We have two different types of investment. You say the banker looking for those low risk, steady returns on the ground that often looks like maintenance. Let's make sure we're maintaining the places that we've built.
Right.
And then you contrast that to more of the venture capitalist approach, where we're looking at a series of high risk, high return investments, not so much going for a big mega project and hoping that it works out, but maybe a series of a lot of different pilots and understanding that maybe half will work out, half not so much, but we'll embrace the former and work from there. Could you speak a little bit about the latter, this VC approach, and perhaps speak to the chaos that cities may have to embrace whenever they're introducing these pilots?
Right. Well, you look at the eight examples that I gave, the 8 projects that I went out and we tested and tried out. None of those projects would be identified through any type of formal process. Cities like to work in formal process. They like to hold surveys and public engagement sessions and bring people in and have them stand up and talk one at a time. This is all very comfortable for us. And there's a lot of people listening who do this kind of work who are bristling at the idea that it's comfortable, because they'll say, no, it's really uncomfortable. People get up and yell at us and shout at us. No, it's really comfortable. The reason we do it that way is because it's comfortable. It's very uncomfortable to actually go out and have to confront how people live in the community and how they struggle with what we have built. It's really uncomfortable. And so when I'm talking about the chaos part of it, I'm really leaning into 2 parts of this. The first one is that we need to get out of our comfort zone and this kind of sterile environment that we've created, where the feedback loops that we have are kind of filtered through very sterile kind of ways to blunt the impact. We have to subject ourselves to the real, reality in our places. But the other side of this is this hacker idea, the idea that we're going to try a bunch of things and a lot of them won't work. And that's okay. And it's okay because if you're spending $800 to find out if something doesn't work.
Totally.
So I gave this to my dad once. One of the things that we did in this neighborhood's first process is we came up with this like contest, and we got a little ways in it, and then it kind of got derailed. That's another long story. but I'll give you the gist of the way the contest was set up. The idea was we wanted 20 people to come in, and we were going to give them $100 each to go out and do something to make the neighborhood better. So 20 people, $100 each, that's $2,000. We're going to spend $2,000. And we did that. And people went out and they did, plantings here, and someone gave away ice cream to people on the street. And there were all these like ideas of people trying things out with $100. Like, what can you do with $100? I told this to my dad. I said, here's what we're going to do. And my dad, who's a wonderful guy, but he's like, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard, Chuck. And I'm like, why is that stupid, Dad? And he goes, well, someone is going to take your $100 and they're going to go buy Christmas tree lights and put them up in a tree for themselves and say, thanks for buying my Christmas tree lights. And I'm like, Dad, I get where you're coming from, Dad.
Yeah.
Like, I get it. But what you've just done is I've spent $100 to identify the person who doesn't have the answer for me.
Sure.
Because in the second round, I'm going to take the best 5 people from the first round and I'm going to give them $400 each. You did something really great with $100. What can you do with $400? And so now I spent another $2,000, but I've got, 5 different, like slightly bigger projects. The next round was 2 people with $1,000. And then the final round was going to be 1 person with $4,000. Well, you tell me one creative person who does something awesome with $100, something incredible with $400, something amazing with $1,000, give them $4,000, or if we could increase it to $10,000, what are they going to do? So what you've done here is you've not wasted $100 on Christmas tree lights. What you've done is you've invested $6,000 to identify the best ideas that you can now do writ large.
Totally.
Businesses do this all the time. They have recognized that instead of having some big, focus group meeting where we're going to roll out 3 products and then have people give us our feedback, and then we're going to spend millions of dollars rolling those out. What they do is they experiment with many small little rollouts in different places. And what gains momentum, they will then expand that. And what gains momentum more, they will expand that. This is, really at the end of the day, this is Darwin. This is like the insights of how humanity, how civilization, how ecosystems assemble themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And if we understand that cities are human habitats, that we're merely assembling ecosystems, we have to lean into the feedback part of this and allow that to drive our investments, as opposed to what we believe is our, genius and vision for what should be.
Fantastic, Chuck. Thank you. And this reminds me of a story that we just published on strongtowns.org. We have a fantastic member of Louisville, Sean Riley. He had identified a particular street in his neighborhood, Bardstown Road. It was a strode cutting through what was a really strong traditional development pattern, great sidewalks, that Main Street style like buildings. But the cars were speeding around. It wasn't as active as a place that it used to be. The city of Louisville had a plan, I think $6 million, to eventually do a redesign of the streets. But of course, they were waiting for a series of traffic studies, finding consultants, all that good stuff.
Right.
But Sean took that document, got his posse at the Bardstown Road Improvement Group, and like Better Block, just did a series of small bets. For one day, they had a vision block, set up some hay bales to have curb cutouts, set up some street trees and big old bourbon barrels, some DIY crosswalks and bike lanes.
Yep.
At the cost of $2,000.
Right.
Achieving much of which the city would hope to eventually achieve, but at a considerably larger scale and not nearly as adaptable.
I can't tell you how many times I was in a meeting back in my days working as a city planner for many different cities. And I would go in with some type of budget proposal, $3,000 to do this thing in the park, or $5,000 to figure this thing out. And they would sit and chew on me, and they would just be like, can you do it for $1,000 less? And what are we getting for this? And and they were just like so uptight about it. And then the next agenda item would be the city engineer coming in, and it'd be like, I need $80,000 to study this traffic model for whatever. Mm-hmm. And I knew it was BS. I knew like it was just junk. Like it was not it was like voodoo projection modeling. And the city would just like without like a moment's hesitation be like, okay, if that's what the cost is, of course we do it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, what Mike Lydon taught me, and I think what this story that you bring up says is, Mike Lydon said to me once, he's like, for a fraction of the price of an engineering study, we can actually go out and create the conditions that they're trying to model.
Yeah.
And we can actually then watch for a week or two what happens, and then understand in real life what actually happens when we do this. Why anyone would ever do an engineering study to project what would happen for many multiple times it makes no sense at all.
Mm-hmm. A little chaotic, but better.
A little chaotic. Yeah. It's beautiful,
Chuck,
though.
That is the top of the hour.
Thanks, man.
Thank you. This was fantastic. And thank you for everyone who joined us live, submitted great questions. Thank you to our folk on Facebook. A lot of love for you all. Thank you for everyone who joined us live via Zoom. You guys asked some fantastic questions that I hope gave you some deeper insights to Chuck's presentation on Tuesday. We have, go ahead,
next
Chuck.
week. We got Quint Studer coming in next week to talk about setting up your community to post coronavirus. And I'm anxious. I've heard him speak a few times, and it's always engaging. It's always fascinating. And I'm excited to hear that. So I know it's a later in the day. I think it's like 3:00 on Tuesday and then a little bit later on Thursday, but next week will be Quint. So we're gonna be really happy with that.
Yeah, likewise. Looking forward to it. And listeners, you can go to strongtowns.org/events to find the event link, and look forward to kicking it with you all then. It'll be fun.
Hey, thanks, Jacob. You're so good at this.
It's nice chatting. We get great questions. We have some fantastic advocates who are looking to include these principles in their own communities, always coming in with great questions. And if we didn't knock it out here, again, I encourage you to share these questions on the Strong Towns community as well, community.strongtowns.org. We're up to about 1,000 folk there. A lot of great activity. Chuck's kicking it there. A few posts recently that have sparked some great conversations. So please, let's keep this conversation going, and we'll see you all next week.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Talk soon.